The last month has been good to travel stocks, with the likes of Delta, Norwegian Cruise Lines and Carnival on the up ahead of the summer season. Delta, to take one example, is coming off its longest winning streak ever. Shifting gears, looking at cruise operators, they've also been going strong, but expectations for higher rates in the month ahead could be bad news for investors in this space. And we'll take a look at Carnival shares. They're slumping this morning. However, even after reporting second quarter earnings above expectations, the cruise operator saw a jump in demand, reaching an all-time high for quarterly bookings. Joining us now, James Hardiman, Citi Leisure and Travel Analyst. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I mean, when you look at Carnival's data here, top and bottom line beat, demand and sales better than expected, but investors seem to be really honing on some of these other costs in terms of labor and marketing. Do you think it should be selling off this much at this point?
It's not all that surprising to me. I do think they're to some degree a victim of their own success, right? A lot of people got on board with this story. I mean, we upgraded a month ago and the stock was up 50%. As I talked to investors over the last week or two, it really felt like expectations had gotten ahead of themselves. We were hearing some pretty unreasonable whisper numbers in terms of the profitability for the current quarter. But at the end of the day, I mean, if you had showed me these results 3 months ago, I think everybody would be doing backflips. I think expectations got ahead of themselves. And then to your point, some of the cost takeaways here were, I wouldn't even call them concerning, but surprising for sure. And so at the end of the day, they beat on the strength of really strong demand, really strong pricing. But there were some offsets from a cost perspective that we're going to have to work through over the remainder of the year.
And we did see some other cruise operators, Royal Caribbean and Norwegian, also taking a hit after that earnings data came out. But how much pricing power do you think Carnival has over its rivals here?
Well, I mean, our call is that the entire group has significant pricing power relative to other forms of travel and entertainment, right? I mean, the math that we do suggests that the cruise industry as a whole, ticket prices are up sort of low to mid single digits versus 2019. There aren't a whole lot of consumer sectors that can say the same thing. Most notably, when you compare the cruise sector to land-based vacations, we used to be talking about a 20 to 30% discount to that form of entertainment. We're now looking at more like 40 to 50%. And so I think as consumers become more discerning, try to pinch pennies a little bit, I think cruise by comparison will look like a really good bargain.
So then why do you think that cruises are able to do much better then versus, I mean, obviously consumers have a lot of choices about how they spend their money on travel. Why cruises versus, say, other forms of travel?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is just that they sat out the last couple of years of unprecedented inflation, right? These ships were just trying to get back onto the water. This is the industry that was probably the hardest hit from the pandemic. And so a lot of it is just reversion to normality, which I think is going to help them from a pricing perspective. And then the other piece is I think they've added significant assets to the offering in recent years. Particularly, we talked about land-based vacations. Pretty much all these companies that now have major sort of land-based islands, effectively, where you take the cruise, you spend a day at a big resort island that's specifically for cruise customers, and I think customers are really eating that up. That is, I think, a more effective asset than it's ever been.
A lot of people wondering then, what is actually propping up demand at this point? Because at first, when people started to travel, it was, it's pent up demand. It's been a while now, but you also have, a consumer that's trying to tighten purse strings. Why do you think we're still seeing this sort of demand here?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say early in the restart for cruise, it was all about that pent-up demand piece. There were some estimates out there that maybe 50 million vacations had been canceled or deferred, and so much of that initial business came from people that had been longtime cruisers and were looking to get back on. I think what we've seen over the last quarter or two is that new to cruise segment that Carnival just finished talking about, the fact that it is back to, and in a lot of instances ahead of where it was in 2019. So that group, right, young millennial families that are looking to see the world on a budget, are really beginning to step up and into the cruise space.
And James, I want to get your predictions for what we might see with the 4th of July travel weekend. I mean, AAA predicting record-breaking travel volumes by car and air. About 50.7 million Americans will travel 50 miles or more. 4.17 million Americans will fly. So some record-breaking numbers here. Are you seeing those sort of numbers as well? And what does that mean in terms of spending?
It's a great question, and I think it's an open question at this point. I think we have difficult comparisons. If we rewind back to last summer, I do think there was a lot of that revenge spending that was taking place. And I think most of that has worked its way through the system. Depending on what we're talking about here, as I talk about cruise travel, I make the point that a recession would be an improvement for cruise, right? They're coming from a really dark place. Conversely, one of the other verticals that I follow in the theme park space, the numbers that we've seen have been lackluster, to put it mildly. And so the outlook there is, I think, a little bit more troubling. Weather always plays a big role. So a lot of this is going to depend on sort of what sort of weather we see over the next week or so. But certainly that outlook a little bit more troubling.
At least now cruise is steaming ahead, playing catch up after, as you mentioned, being on the back foot due to the pandemic. A big thank you for joining me this morning. James Hardiman, Citi Leisure and Travel Analyst. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.